Hello and welcome to IB History Session 2, Part 2. In this section we will be covering continuation of the bullet point on page 5 of the study guide under Material for Paper 3, Unit 2, Nation Building and Challenges, and we will cover the major compromises and as well as the structure of the Constitution and the U.S. political system. If we are to break down the Constitution and the main fundamental compromises that go into the U.S. Constitution of 1787, we can break down those three areas into the representation of the states, into the branches of government, and we'll fully develop, and it'll continue on the next page, we will develop the subject of federalism. Additionally, any question you're likely to answer on the IB exam will deal with, most likely, comparing the articles to the Constitution, okay, and the reasons for developing the Constitution out from the articles. So on the representation of states, if you'll recall, initially, under the Articles, there's a heavy emphasis on statehood. Each state is represented equally. Tiny Rhode Island, and back then, tiny Georgia, are represented equally with much larger states such as New York, Massachusetts, and especially Virginia, and regardless of their population. And that was the status quo. So any change to that has to be approved by each of those states. In the end, they have to all agree to it to join the Union. They initially had, the initial response was the Virginia Plan, which wanted to shift that fundamentally away from states voting to people voting, and a strict proportional representation was the Virginia Plan. The response was the New Jersey Plan, which wanted to go more or less back to the system under the Articles, where each state was represented equally, and their major compromise was the Great Connecticut Compromise, or the Connecticut Plan, brought by Representative Sherman. And the key there was that we would have a bicameral legislature where one house, the House of Representatives, would represent the population of the United States proportionally. The more people, the more votes, so that populous states are more well represented than less populous states. And then in the Senate, the other house, the other chamber, each state would be represented equally by two senators who are elected separately and who can vote separately, so that a state doesn't just, they don't have to vote simultaneously or be of the same party or anything like that. And that this was a key compromise between the large states and the small states. The small states did not wish to leave the Articles if they would be totally overshadowed by the Virginias and the Massachusetts of the new state and new nation because of their popular vote, nor did the larger states would not want to join a new, stronger government if it would give tons of power to those smaller states who could then boss around the majority of the people. Where a handful of really small states that represents not very many Americans would actually be able to dominate the lawmaking process. So it's a way to harness the lawmaking process into both. You need a majority of the states and a majority of the people as a whole in order to pass laws. The second area of compromise is on the branches of government. Under the Articles, there was only one branch of government, effectively. There really only was a legislative branch that kind of, sort of weakly had some executive function as well. But some areas, such as tax collection, the legislature would pass a law to collect a tax, but then there really was no executive. There really was no enforcement. States were required to simply pay the taxes when it was convenient, and they felt like it. And so it was a big compromise that they would add an executive branch. Now, what role this executive would take there was some diversity of opinion. Some, such as Alexander Hamilton, were so distressed at the lack of executive authority that they wanted to go to a very British model, where the executive would be practically a king, that it would be an elected president, but who would be elected for life, like a king, and have an unlimited veto, like a king. That was very unpopular, but it does represent that there was even that was in theory a possibility. It was a president for life with an unlimited veto. On the far other side was, if you were going to have an executive, there were some who wanted a plural executive, as in the equivalent would be if we simply elected separately the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of the Interior and the Postmaster General and the Attorney General, and those departments had their heads of department elected and they are collectively the executive, but there was no one chief executive to whom they all would answer. The compromise we settled on was to have an elected president with an unlimited number of 4-year terms initially. The term limits don't come about until the 20th century with the 22nd Amendment. An unlimited number of 4-year terms with a president and a vice president to whom the cabinet would answer, and to whom the cabinet would be appointed by that elected chief executive, the president. So that was a compromise as well. The Supreme Court, that there would be a judiciary, that one of its main functions would be to settle those disputes among the states, that they would set up a branch of government, one of whose main roles is to settle those disputes that previously under the Articles had no way to settle. So again, in our second aspect under Part 2 on the Constitution and its structure and compromises, we see again that the topic of compromise comes directly out of the weaknesses of the Articles that we mentioned in Part 1. And finally, the third and most developed area is on the issue of federalism. And we'll break that issue down, and this is into 3 sub-areas. And this is nicely intended to foreshadow the 3 main areas, actually, that lead to causes of the Civil War that we will cover likely in session number 3 next time. The 3 aspects of federalism being states' rights, sectionalism, and slavery. The 3 S's that we'll talk about as far as causes of the Civil War. So the Constitution had to compromise on federalism. This is one of the biggest areas, whereas point number 1 refers to the representation of large and small states. This refers to the issue of states versus the national government. Where does the power lie? In the states? Are they sovereign, or is the national government sovereign? Okay? And they settle this with sort of not settling it, by leaving it a bit in tension. By it contain, especially after the Bill of Rights is added and the 10th Amendment, because the Constitution contains both the Supremacy Clause and the 10th Amendment. The 10th Amendment is also known as the Reserved Powers Clause, a Reserved Powers Clause. The Supremacy Clause indicates that when state and federal law contradict or conflict, particularly in the enforcement of some of the enumerated powers, which are powers expressly given to the federal government, that the federal law will supersede state law. But on the other hand, the 10th Amendment makes express and clear that any powers not given to the federal government, given to the Congress in Article 1, Section 8, are reserved to the states or to the people. So that if it is not an area where the federal government has power, then it should not exercise law and power in that area. That's an area reserved to the states. So it really is a compromise that leaves it up to the lawmakers and the courts to decide what exactly that is and what it will look like in the future. Another area of federalism, that sharing of power between the nation and the state, occurs on the issue of sectionalism. Now, we don't often address sectionalism prior to the Civil War, and so I'm doing this on purpose. Because sectionalism does not only deal with slavery, but a big difference between the two sections is not simply that the North was full of manufacturing and industry. In fact, early on, the main industry in the North was shipping and carrying, and was one of the main sources of profit in the North, and a limited amount of growing industry, and some factories. But in the South, primarily it had an export economy, and so they had to compromise on a sectional divide, which was how to decide taxes and tariffs, and the fact that they expressly banned an export tax, which was something the exporting states very much wanted. Now, economically, export taxes don't make a lot of sense, but nevertheless, they compromised, they banned it. That was something the South wanted, and they also make it clear that taxes must be spread out evenly among the states based on their population, and based on what we'll get to in this next one, the Three-Fifths Compromise. Which brings us to another compromise within the realm of federalism, which is compromise on slavery. At this point in American history, this point in world history, there is a large amount of unfree labor around the world. Serfdom and peasantry and are very common, and free citizenry and free citizens are very rare around the world. And so there is a lot less abolitionism and anti-slavery in the United States at this period than there is 50 years later. And so both North and South, they somewhat agree that slavery is not an ideal situation, but that it's not something that very many people actually want to end. One thing they do agree on and compromise on is to ban slave importation after 1808. And finally, the linchpin compromise on the issue between, that's a sectional issue and a slavery issue, is the Three-Fifths Compromise, where slaves would be counted on the census for the purpose of taxes to the federal government and for the purpose of representation when it comes to the size of states. So the Three-Fifths Compromise is really an issue that cuts across many of these other areas, where slaves would be counted as only 3/5 of a person. Now, this has been interpreted many ways. Often we look at this as degrading to black Americans because they're counted as only 3/5 of a person, that's degrading. But that's also meant to limit the voting power and privilege of the Southern planters who controlled slaves. But it's also a way for them to limit their tax burden. So it's a lot of sides to it. It can be seen as degrading to those who are included as seemingly counted as only 3/5 of a human being. It's a way that the South was able to pay only 3/5 of the ratio of taxes in the early republic. But it was a way that Northerners were able to limit the political power of slave owners. With that being a pretty general summary, the three aspects of federalism, states' rights, sectionalism, and slavery, were three areas of federal compromise, and then federalism, the branches of government, and the representation of large and small states, is a good review of the structure and the main compromises found in the 1787 U.S. Constitution. That concludes Session 2, Part 2. Stay tuned for Session 2, Part 3, where we will look at the causes and effects of the War of 1812.